When we take a look back over the early days of the PlayStation console, there were quite a number of memorable games that were made available, with a great range and mix of games, anything varying from the likes of arcade shooters to racing games, fighting games and action adventure games. But within the first few weeks of the console's release, seen quite a number of incredible titles that went on to span multiple sequels to create long-running franchises that would still be recognised even in modern gaming today. And one of those series all started with the first Tekken game. And Tekken originally started off life in the arcades in 1994 and was later ported to the PlayStation a couple of weeks after the console's release in 95, which was developed and published by Namco. And it's also one of the earliest 3D fighting games to fully utilise 3D rendered graphics for the characters and environments, while using full motion gameplay for the characters' movements and combat mechanics. One of the really cool features about the game, very like a lot of Namco's early games on the PlayStation, similar to the Ridge Racer series, would make use of various mini games and space shooters that you could try and get a high score, and if you managed to complete the game in the allotted time or you defeat all the enemies, it would unlock different perks and features that you could use in the game, maybe like extra characters or different modes and features that you could use. So that in itself was a really cool touch to have with these early games, and it added more to the playability of the entire game. At the time, however, when Tekken was released, Virtua Fighter, that was released by Sega in the arcades and also on the Sega Saturn, had been released a year prior, and Tekken had taken a lot of inspiration from Virtua Fighter, as Virtua Fighter at the time had become probably the dominant fighter in the arcade world. But Tekken quickly became a fan favourite with many fighting game fanatics, that led on to being a massive success on the PlayStation, which sold over 1 million copies, and it later went on to become part of the PlayStation's Platinum collection. And the game was followed up quite quickly with a sequel with Tekken 2 only just about a year later. And that was the crazy thing about the PlayStation back in the early days, is no sooner had a game been developed, they were already working on the sequel pretty much straight away. And you would see games or companies developing sequels that would come out literally months after the initial game's first release, and Tekken was no different. You had other titles, even from Namco specifically, with the likes of Ridge Racer, because again, like Tekken, it was also a port of an arcade game, and literally a few months later there was a sequel of Ridge Racer Revolution, and in Tekken's case, Tekken 2 came out not long after that, and it had improved graphics and visuals. But it was the first Tekken game that really set the standard for what was to come forward thereafter, as it created some very iconic characters that became a staple within the franchise and that are still available even in modern games, even up as far as Tekken 7 that you can play on modern consoles. And what was cool with Tekken is, as well, with the likes of Virtua Fighter even on the Sega Saturn, each character, while fully rendered in 3D, has its own unique visual aesthetic, but it also allows players to play with their own playstyles, as each character has their own combat moves and aesthetics that can appeal to different players' styles. Some players and characters are easier to utilise and get into than others. Some will take a bit more finesse and practice to get familiar with the movesets, but once you master it, you will have a great experience, although it will test your patience, as the early few matches that you play, especially in the arcade mode, you should be able to get through it with relative ease, but as you go through the arcade or the story, you can gradually see an increase in the difficulty, so it can be quite difficult to win matches, so you have to adapt your gameplay and fighting styles in order to have a chance to win. So you can either go all out attack and just bash buttons, or you can play more defensively and just catch people using counters. But there's a great variety of mixed moves, martial arts moves, and even grapple moves as well. When you grab someone, you can do a special move that can take out a ton of energy out of your opponent and do a lot of damage. But as with a lot of these fighting games, it really is just all trial and error, but you'll have a lot of fun with it. But Tekken proved that 3D games, and specifically fighting games, were becoming a dominant force during the early to mid 90s, and especially on the PlayStation console, as the PlayStation has an absolute ton of fighting games, and many of them that you wouldn't even see, as a lot of them were released in other regions, mainly Japan. But Tekken, alongside of likes of Virtua Fighter, set the standard really for 3D fighting games. Even when I go back to my own experience playing Tekken, it was a few months into getting to play the PlayStation itself, and my mate that I originally got to play on his PlayStation with the first ever experience experience that I had on the console. I have done previous videos on my first experience with the PlayStation, so I'll make sure to drop a link down to those videos in the description. And while a few months had passed, my mate had gotten a hold of a second-hand copy of Tekken, and he took it down to the house one weekend. Now, he loved it and he was trying to get into it. Mind you, he wasn't that great at playing it, but Tekken can be quite a difficult game to get to grips with when you're not used to it. And for me personally, because I'd come off the back of getting used to playing Resident Evil and playing racing games and stuff, and I was more of a Mortal Kombat player. I always played like some Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. So Tekken essentially was the first proper 3D fighting game that I'd ever played. And honestly, it took me a while to really warm to it and to get used to it. I liked the visuals and I thought it looked cool, but when I went to play it, I just didn't really know what I was doing. I hadn't a clue. It was so different from playing the likes of Mortal Kombat on the likes of the Super Nintendo or even the early days of the PlayStation, like where the button movements were almost instantaneous. With Tekken, the movesets required you to pull off combos, and you had to be very specific on how you used the combos in order to do any damage. Plus, the computer AI could also adapt to your movements, so a lot of the times they would block a lot of your attacks. So you had to learn how to get familiar with your fighting styles and even your use of various movesets. So it took quite a while to really warm to it. Even when I got to play Tekken 2 a few months later, another friend of mine had got it for Christmas and he took it over, and I did like it, and I found it a wee bit easier to get into compared to Tekken 1. But again, I still struggled with 3D fighters at the time. I just wasn't really that good at them for quite a long time, and I didn't have a lot of patience. I found it wasn't until Tekken 3 came out that where I really found myself getting into fighters, more so 3D fighters, and by then I had played enough of them that it just really started to click. But then Tekken 3 was a completely different animal altogether, and it is considered to be the best fighting game on the PlayStation, and I totally agree with that, because out of all the Tekken games that I played, Tekken 3 for me is hands down my personal favourite one. That game is awesome. It's just absolutely phenomenal. But again, it was also the easiest one I could pick up and play. When you had the characters likes of Eddie Gordo, you didn't even have to really be good at the game. You did all these mad moves and flips. It made you look like as if that you were a professional at the game without even having to do much work. So that in itself, I think the easier entry point into the game definitely made it more appealing. Whereas with likes of Tekken 1 and Tekken 2 more specifically, well, mainly the first one, the entry level into gamers that were struggling with these type of games, it wasn't as forgiving compared to later games in the series. You really had to have your wits about you. But again, the control systems by then with the earlier games hadn't been as refined as much compared to the later games. So you had to pretty much just learn to adapt and just work with what you had at the time. But that doesn't take away from the experience that Tekken gave you. Yes, at first for myself, like, it took a while to get into, but now after revisiting it years later, I still struggle with it. I can get so far and I can win the arcade modes a couple of times, but not before I get destroyed in most of the fights. So I still have to learn to adapt my fighting styles and just to kind of pick my moments of when to attack and when to defend and so forth. So you really have to have a strategy around your fighting styles. But even looking back over it years later, it is a classic. It's still just as good as I do remember, even though, like I said, it took me a while to get into it. But I appreciate it and I respect the game for what it is. And you can clearly see the basis of how it evolved from its original standpoint with the original game, and how it evolved over later generations in the series up to the likes of Tekken 3, which is considered by many not just the best fighter on the PlayStation, but it's the best fighting game in my opinion in the entire Tekken series. It just has something about it that just really stands out, that the other games just, even though they're really good in their own right, they've just never been able to replicate. But I suppose it all had to start somewhere, and the earlier Tekken games were proof of the rise in popularity of 3D fighters at the time. Like, the PlayStation had tons of fighter games on the computer. Even since starting this channel, I found myself going back and I'm finding a ton of games that I didn't even know existed, and it's great now that I'm getting to experience them. Now, I'm still not that great at fighting games, I'm not going to deny that for a second, but it's a really cool way to get to experience them now, and to look at games that you either wanted to play back in the day but you couldn't, or now you can get access to them through the likes of emulation, or if you can buy copies on eBay, which a lot of them in all honesty aren't cheap. So if you can afford them, go ahead, but if not, emulation is probably your best alternative. But even at that, I highly recommend that you do go back and check out these older type games, especially with the likes of the earliest Tekken game. Yes, it is difficult to get into and to master, but you can see how good of a game it is once you do put some time into it. It has a really good mix of characters, some great movesets and fighting styles, and it just expanded with each sequel that came after it. So if you do want to see why these games are so good, I highly recommend you check them out and check out Tekken for yourself to see what you think, as this game alone is a very important part part of video game history that really set a standard for a lot of fighting games, not just on consoles, but in the arcades as well, as they were very popular at the time. So I would love to know what your thoughts are of the original Tekken game on the PlayStation. How did you play it? Did you manage to even play it in the arcade when it was available in the arcade, or did you play it on the console initially back in the day? And if so, what are your thoughts on the game, and do you have any stories to share? I would love to hear what experiences you have of the game, so be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more videos on other fighting games on the PlayStation that are very like Tekken, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be updated when those videos are released. And if you would like to see more gameplay videos around the Tekken series, you can check out this playlist here on screen to see more of those games in action. And remember to keep those gaming memories alive.
You lose. Continue. 2. Game over.